Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will look at President Joe Biden's South Asia visit, the Quad Summit, the formation of new organizations and institutions, and how does that really impact the regional power balance in the region? What does it mean for the region? Joining me on this episode is Professor Harsh Pant, and I'm Naghma. You're watching the Ideas Factory on the ORF platform. Welcome, Harsh, to the Ideas Factory. I would like to start with President Joe Biden's South Asia visit, his visit to Japan, and this was during his visit. It was the second in-person summit of the Quad leaders. While this summit was taking place, it was also interesting that China and Russia were also coming together, and China-Russia ties are also getting stronger. So, how is this? What really has been the outcome of Quad in terms of reshaping the power balance in the region, and how does the China-Russia tie really impact that?
Thanks, Naghma. I think the intent behind Mr. Biden's visit was to underscore that Indo-Pacific remains one of the most important geographies for American foreign policy. And despite what is happening in Ukraine, America is not giving up its focus on the Indo-Pacific. So I think this visit, this trip to two important allies in South Korea and Japan, and holding this Quad summit in Tokyo, as well as unveiling of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, all of them underscored the commitment that perhaps Washington is putting on the table and trying to reshape its own credibility in the region. Which there have been questions about America's ability to continue to engage with the Indo-Pacific in the light of what is happening in Ukraine. There has been questions about Biden administration's own Indo-Pacific approach and whether they have it in Washington at the moment to continue to invest in the region. And I think Mr. Biden is sort of underscoring that yes, the challenges are there in Europe in the Eurasian context, but China remains the principal challenger. And I think that was also underscored by a recent speech that Secretary of State Blinken gave on China, which is considered to be a watered-down version of America's China strategy under Biden. So I think all in all, they were trying to put all these jigsaw pieces together and trying to underscore the reality of America's foreign policy posture in the Indo-Pacific. And I think a number of aspects to this engagement were visible. One is to basically once again reiterate American commitment to traditional allies like Japan and South Korea. And I think that has been done. Japan is willing to take on more responsibility. Japan is redefining its defense posture in the Indo-Pacific. There was also this attempt to come to terms with this reality that in the Indo-Pacific, the contestation is not simply geopolitical, but it is essentially geo-economic in nature. And therefore, the unveiling of the Indo-Pacific economic framework has been a very important development in that regard. And finally, the Quad Summit brings in the larger framework in a region which is devoid of institutions at the moment, or credible, effective institutional frameworks at the moment, again underscoring that Quad is emerging as an important platform. And Quad is unique, Quad is interesting because India is part of that engagement. Japan, Australia, and America have been traditional alliance partners, but it is India's entry into the Quad that makes Quad enticing, it makes Quad interesting, and it makes Quad more credible institution framework or a platform under the present circumstances of geopolitical contestation with China.
What kind of challenges, Harsh, but Quad is facing from the China-Russia ties? Or because when we saw President Biden's visit was almost concluding, at that time China and Russia were engaging in a joint exercise. So China-Russia ties are also reshaping the great power relations in the region, and Quad is much more relevant from a regional perspective. What kind of challenge does it face?
I think some very serious strategic thinking is required now, not only by the regional players, but I would say even by India in terms of what is happening. Because as you are mentioning, Japan, we saw how China and Russia came together for joint exercises, air exercises, right at the time when Quad was assembling and Quad Summit was being undertaken by Japan, clearly signaling the intent by China and Russia that their partnership is also is getting strengthened, and they are looking at Quad as an oppositional platform. They're looking at Quad as a platform which is trying to contain China, and they are building up their own relationship primarily now in opposition to the Quad. So I think this would mean that, and of course for Russia, the Ukraine crisis is going to be an inflection point, and the ties with China are only expected to grow. So what does it mean for the region? I think it means that that Russia's role in the region will have to be rethought. We have already seen Japan, for example, was reaching out to Russia, has been trying to reach out to Russia for a very long time, but now it has given up. India's ties with Russia are under strain because of Ukraine and because of what is happening in the Indo-Pacific. So I think some difficult questions there as to how do you manage this power transition in the region, and at a time when Quad is becoming much more vocal, much more open, much more effective, and a credible force in the region, and much more attractive force in the region, because this is Indo-Pacific does not really have an institutional architecture that can manage this turbulence. And for many, Quad is seen as a nucleus of that wider arrangement. So whether it would be an easy transition for Quad going forward, or whether it's going to be very turbulent, it still remains to be seen. But I think the intent from the four Quad members was to make it a platform where the four countries can offer an alternative, economic and alternative political framework in the region, which requires these kind of frameworks, which requires these kind of arrangements. And of course, Quad members have been trying to insist that, look, this is much more than simply about China. This is about how the
Yes.
region can manage health crisis, how the region can manage economic turbulence, how the region can manage deficit in infrastructure and connectivity, how the region can frame certain norms and standards in the region. So I think this is for US, Japan, Australia, and India. The idea is to create something that not only challenges China's normative principles in the region, but also create something where other countries will automatically join, rather than being seen as a coercive approach that some would say China has taken in the region.
It's interesting, as you mentioned, there is no institutional architecture to manage the region, when we talk of Indo-Pacific. So how do you see the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum in this light? Would this forum provide that institutional framework which is so needed in the region to manage this region, the Indo-Pacific region? Also because, as you had mentioned, that India's presence in the Quad is what makes it more interesting and more enticing. India is part of this Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, and China is not. Remember, India had walked out of RCEP, because China was there. But now this excludes China and India's presence there. So what kind of alternatives will this, or how will it help the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum?
I think it's a good start by the Biden administration, because I think finally Washington is recognizing that they need to put forward a strong economic architecture in the region. China is powerful in the Indo-Pacific. China is the dominant player in the Indo-Pacific in economic terms, and China is so attractive to a number of countries because it is presenting an economic alternative to the region. And I think, therefore, for America now, for Biden administration now, to come to terms with this reality after the Trump administration pulled out of the TPP is an important development. It still is sketchy in many ways. Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as it was unveiled in Tokyo by U.S. President, still remains a work in progress. It's still something that I think needs more concrete measures. For many countries in the region, traditional American partners in the region that were waiting for America to articulate its economic, its geo-economic response, I think this is an important start. What Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is that it is not a traditional trade agreement, and that I think America has made it very clear. America's domestic politics does not allow America to come to the table and offer something like TPP, and now we are talking of CPTPP. So America is not in that position to offer tariff reductions, market access, etc. What America can offer and what America is trying to offer with the help of other like-minded countries in the region is a framework which can work towards setting certain standards and norms in the region, whether it is digital trade, whether it is environmental standards, labor standards, etc. And I think that is a good development, as this is sowing the seeds of the regional governance architecture. And if and for India in particular, I think this is an important development, because India is part of this, will be part of this from its very inception. India is not part of the larger economic framework, because we are not part of RCEP, we are not part of TPP and CPTPP, and we don't intend to be. So I think this framework allows India to be an important part of the larger governance. And when you talk of governance, when you talk of setting the standards from the beginning, I think for India to be part of this table is certainly going to be an important development, and is already making India an important part of the way institutional architecture in the region is evolving. So I think for India
So,
it is good, but for America there is much more that America will have to do to convince the region that there is real substance to Indo-Pacific economic
okay.
framework.
All right. So you're saying it holds a lot of promise for India, also because it probably helps India to build closer ties with other countries in the region, and does it give another chance to for India to pivot, for its pivot to Indo-Pacific?
Absolutely, and I think that is again, India is has been doing a lot. India has been engaging with its Indo-Pacific like-minded countries on a very substantive basis. But India's weak point has been that India is not part of the larger trade arrangements, and I think that an economic tie is being so vital to the way Indo-Pacific is evolving and will evolve. This gives India a foothold in that conversation.
And another interesting development that took place in the past week is India's formal outreach to the Taliban government in Afghanistan. It was a surprise, it was unannounced, though we know that India has had a lot of goodwill across spectrum in Afghanistan. India has been providing, even after the Taliban government took over, India has been providing humanitarian assistance, be it COVID vaccine, be it wheat, be it polio vaccines, all kinds of help. But the recent visit by the Indian delegation to Afghanistan, how do we see that? There have been questions that are we kind of recognizing or giving recognition to Taliban? Or the other thing is that Taliban is very keen to establish a contact with the Indian government because it sees that there is not much promise of help coming out of a debt-ridden, economically, uh, you know, in a turmoil, Pakistan, politically and economic turmoil in Pakistan. So it does not really see any promise from Pakistan. It's really important for the Taliban government to maintain that kind of relationship with India. But what about India's outreach?
Naghma, I don't know if you recall, but ages ago when we used to when the government had fallen in Afghanistan, and we were discussing the future of Afghanistan. I think one of the points we were discussing at that point, at that moment, was that, look, yes, for many it was doom and gloom. For many it was suddenly that Pakistan has won. But there was a warning that, look, this is going to be a long process. And Pakistan's win, that the fact that Taliban came to power, did not really imply much, given that Pakistan itself was imploding. That Pakistan's capacity to do much about its so-called win in Afghanistan was really, a sham. There was nothing there that Pakistan could have done given its own vulnerabilities, and exactly it has turned out to be that way. That India cannot be ignored has been a reality in the region for quite some time. That whether it is Taliban 2.0 or 3.0 or 4.0, the reality is that today India is in a different league compared to Pakistan. People often used to compare, that this is going to be 1992, 1990s redo. But certainly, if you look at India and Pakistan today, there is no comparison. Pakistan is imploding. Pakistan's politics is divisive. Pakistan's politics is unable to respond to the local challenges. Pakistan's economy is in shambles. So for Pakistan to do anything about its so-called victory in Afghanistan was always going to be very, very difficult and very difficult to manage. But I think the moment Taliban came to power, they also realized that the region has changed and the world has changed. And as they've been trying to seek greater recognition, they also know that without India's help, they won't be able to manage a lot of lot of their own internal problems. And what India did very carefully and I think very effectively is to leverage its own role as a developmental partner, as a partner which keeps the Afghan people at the heart of its engagement. So therefore, the humanitarian aid, the vaccine diplomacy, whether it was the support on with wheat, the food crisis, all of that had to do with how India can build capacity in the region. And I think just recently, very very recently, we have heard Taliban even saying, Mullah Omar San saying that look, there is no harm if we even send Afghan soldiers to India for training. So there is a change in the mindset. There is an evolution of Taliban in the direction that India needs to be engaged with. India is a partner. India as a neighboring country cannot be ignored. Taliban 1.0 could have done everything they wanted to do with Pakistan, but this is neither the age of Taliban 1.0 nor this is the age of Pakistan in the region, with Pakistan's credibility being at its lowest ebb. So I think there are a number of issues which have given India an entry into this discussion, into its engagement with the Taliban. India is still not recognizing the Taliban because no one else is also doing that. Countries across the world are still testing the waters, are still trying to ensure what the Taliban can do on substantive grounds before they can move towards any substantive engagement. But I think there is no harm, and that's what India is doing in reaching out to the Taliban and trying to get a sense of what is happening within Afghanistan and how India can help ordinary Afghan men and women who really want help at a time when they are facing enormous pressures from multiple dimensions, and Taliban's own ability to govern has been found to be very, very ineffective. So I think,
Yeah.
given all that, India has made this outreach, and this hopefully will lead to something more substantive, and hopefully this will lead to also India's own concerns being addressed, which, as you would know, very recent report of the UN also suggests that Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba are still operating from Afghanistan territory. So I think India needs to ensure that India's interests are protected, that India does not become a target from Afghanistan as far as these groups are concerned. But by and large, in terms of the geopolitical reordering in the region, India has made it very clear that it will engage, but it will engage on its own terms with the government in Kabul.
So India is engaging strategically, and India has always had the goodwill of the Afghan people at the center of its policy towards Afghanistan. Right now, also, as you say, India's engagement with the Taliban has been very strategic and keeping its own interests in mind. On that note, let's look back at how the current government's foreign policy has shaped in these last 8 years. We've had celebration of completion of 8 years of Modi government and various developmental projects and GDP and the economy. But when we look at or talk about the foreign policy, how has India emerged in terms of its, if you look at the neighbors or if you look at China and the US, the foreign policy, have you seen any major transition during these 8 years?
I would say yes, and I would say that at a number of levels, we have seen some interesting developments. If you're looking at Indian foreign policy trajectory, one is, I think, to begin with, and since we are talking about this issue at a time when the world is grappling with the Ukraine crisis, you see how India has positioned itself on the Ukraine crisis without being defensive of why it is doing what it is doing. So you see,
Yeah.
Dr. Jaishankar's statements across the world. You also see India not shying away from a robust debate on its own role in the region and giving it back to its critics. That look, this is, as I think, as was mentioned, that India's priorities will be defined by India's interests. India's position on Ukraine has been defined by how India considers its own role in the region and in the world, and that's exactly one of the big changes that despite the pressure on India to side one way or another, if you look at India's position on Ukraine, it has been very carefully calibrated. And what it ensures is that it makes it very clear to the world that India will respond to such challenges on its own terms. And interestingly, what has happened is, despite that crisis, India has been able to strengthen its ties with European countries, with the US, with Japan, with Australia, despite differences. An acknowledgement that there are differences, but those differences does not mean that strategic mapping of your convergence does not take place. So I think that has been one interesting aspect of the evolution in terms of how India has projected itself on the global stage, with a degree of confidence, with a degree of reassurance, and with very clearly articulating what it wants from the global order for the sustenance of its own interests. I think on other aspects, if you see, for example, China, the Modi government started off engaging the Chinese government, and the results were not very favorable. And after Galwan, there has been a significant shift, a significant inflection point, and that is going to lead, and that is already leading to a significant shift in the way India thinks about its own relationships. India thinks about its own domestic capacities. India thinks about its own global engagements. India thinks about its own global role. So I think China and we are now looking at China and telling China that, look, China, there are substantive problems in India China engagement, but the ball is in Chinese court in some ways, to redefine or to come to terms with that engagement. So that is, I think, an important development, in the sense that India is now saying that we have tried and China has not helped us, and that trial period ends now. Now China should work its way through to make India a partner. India will not take any additional steps. India wants to ensure that its interests are protected and preserved. And I think third point, which is about neighborhood, that there has been, I think, a distinct shift, and we have talked about this over the last several sessions, towards the east. This idea that Pakistan's centrality in India's foreign policy has been broken, and that is an important, I think, change, because for a long time, in fact, for the last 70 years, we were told that, look, Pakistan is critical to India. That engagement with Pakistan is very important. That you have to engage with Pakistan. You have to see how you can find a modus vivendi with Pakistan. Because if you don't resolve Pakistan, your global credentials are not taken seriously. I think India has turned it on its head. In the last few years, we have not engaged with Pakistan, and yet our foreign policy has become more ambitious. It has had a larger footprint. It has been more credible. So I think this binary, that India has to constantly look at Pakistan and see what it can do with Pakistan to ensure that its global footprint is effective. That aspect has been broken, and I think that has liberated Indian foreign policy in many ways, to invest in other geographies, to think of other neighbors more productively, and to articulate a more robust response to the challenges that are ever evolving. And finally, I think the focus has been, and this is where we started our conversation with, the focus has concretely shifted to the Indo-Pacific, and that India and the Indo-Pacific are linked. Without India, there won't be Indo-Pacific, and Indo-Pacific won't have a substantive future if India is not invested in the Indo-Pacific. So I think what we are now doing is investing diplomatically, economically, even in terms of militarily, substantively, in the way we look at this vast maritime geography as the key locus of our foreign policy. So I think a lot of these developments have been, part of this last several years of Modi government. Some of that are larger structural changes in the region, in the world. Some of that are about the way this government has articulated and responded to some of the challenges. But together, they have given a picture of a wider foreign policy spectrum, which is evolving, which is more reassured, and which articulates a more confident assertion by India of its national interests.
All right. So, if you look at India's foreign policy trajectory in the last 8 years, it has been evolving and it has become more robust. It is not defensive, as Harsh just mentioned, and that's something which is a positive. If we look at what India's stand was in during the Ukraine crisis, we've seen how India and China relations have evolved. Also, Galwan was an inflection point. So, if one thing that has changed during these 8 years is also that Pakistan's centrality in India's foreign policy is also broken. So, that's it from us on this episode of the Ideas Factory. But I would like to remind remind all our viewers that you can send in your questions, to ask your questions, send in your comments, and we would like to, or we would love to take your questions during the next episode of the Ideas Factory. So stay tuned in. Thank you for watching.